Howdy, and welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. The Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Let's get to it. Howdy, welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. First things first, this is not episode 1, this is an introduction. I'm going to try to answer 2 questions here. The first is this: what is the Preaching Poetry Podcast about? Why does it exist? What is it for? The short answer is this: that the Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Now, what does that mean? Well, essentially, I'm an amateur. I'm not an expert. I don't have a graduate degree or a PhD in poetry, so we're not going to do a lot of look at the technical aspects of poetry, but instead, I read poetry because I want to discover something beautiful or something true, because I want to receive inspiration, or because I want to motivate myself. Poetry is a good place to go for this, because poets look at the world differently than most people. You have to become a good poet. You see, a poet's life is not that much different from yours or mine. They just learn to see the things that are ordinary in a different way. So I look at poetry as a way to discover deep and profound truth through written and through spoken word. Because poetry becomes that vehicle into another world. Or at least it begins to pull back the veil between what we see and reality. What's really there? What does this look like? Well, to answer that question, let's talk about a man named Billy Collins. Okay, Billy Collins is one of the most famous poets in America alive today. He was the poet laureate of the United States for a while, and he has published quite a few volumes of poetry, and people tend to really like what he has to say. One poem that he wrote called Baby Listening, he writes this poem, he's at a hotel, he's walked into his room, and he's looking at the little card that talks about guest services and all of that stuff, and he notices one of the services that the hotel staff offers people is that they offer a baby listening service. Now, what does that mean? Baby listening. Well, there's 2 ways you could look at it, right? You could see that it's baby listening, meaning the person at the front desk will listen to your baby. So maybe you need to go down the hall to get ice or something like that. You don't want to take the baby with you, so you take the phone off the hook. You ask the operator or the person at the desk to, hey, I want the baby listening service. Please listen to my baby. And you put the phone down next to the baby, and the person at the front desk listens to your baby to make sure your baby's okay while you go get ice or go to the vending machine or take a shower, or whatever it is you're doing. But there's another way to look at this phrase, baby listening, right? It could be that the baby is the one doing the listening. So Billy Collins imagines in his poem that it's not just that someone is listening to the baby, or that someone maybe, steps out for a smoke break and doesn't listen to the baby and something terrible happens. I mean, he does say poetry is built for that sort of a thing. But he also says, what if the baby is the one listening? What if the baby is the person listening to the person at the front desk? And so in the poem, he outlines this idea that this phrase, baby listening, can mean a couple of different things. And in the poem, titled Baby Listening, he says this: lucky for some of us, poetry is a place where both are true at once, where meaning only one thing at a time spells malfunction. Do you see what we're talking about now? Another poem that Billy Collins wrote is called Bathtub Families, and he's standing in a pharmacy or a CVS or something like that, looking around, and he sees on the little rack there, this thing called a bathtub family. And what it really is it's like rubber ducks, but it's a family of little animals that you buy to put in the bath so that your kid can play with them, right? Well, what's exciting about that? What's poetic about a rubber ducky? Not a lot. But if you're a poet, if you've learned to look at the world in a different way, we'll see Billy Collins, when he looked at these bathtub families, it amused him. It made him laugh, tickled his funny bone, whatever you want to say. But in this poem, he talks about how this is a hilarious image, a fun image in his head. And he just sort of plays with the idea of bathtub families for a while in his poem. And what he says, again, to quote the poem entitled Bathtub Families, he says, "I think what I am really saying is that language is better than reality. So it doesn't have to be bath time for you to enjoy all the bathtub families as they float in the air around your head." See, Billy Collins has learned to look at even mundane and ordinary things and to see the possibilities around them, to see the beauty around them, to see the fun around them. The world is full of all of these little opportunities, and poets train themselves to see those things, to notice those things, to enjoy those things. Now, I told you at the beginning I was going to answer 2 questions. So I've spent a little bit of time telling you about what the Preaching Poetry Podcast is supposed to do. But now I want to answer the question, why did I name it the Preaching Poetry Podcast? Because if you listen to the name, it sounds like I'm going to be a preacher and we will use poetry as our text, and maybe there'll be some kind of sacrament or an altar call or whatever. But that's really not the point here. In truth, I'm calling it the Preaching Poetry Podcast because what I want us to do is I want us to understand that poems aren't just there for us to enjoy, and poets aren't just there for us to enjoy their work, but instead they can mold us, they can shape us, they can change us. And actually the name for the podcast was inspired by the Scotch poet Robert Burns. He wrote a poem called Epistle to a Young Friend, and he wrote it in the Scottish dialect. I'm not going to read it in the Scottish dialect because I don't want to offend any of y'all who are Scottish or have family who are Scottish. I have family that is Scottish, but I've never been to Scotland. I don't know people. I'm not going to make fun of the accent, and I don't want to butcher it. So instead, I'm going to read the English translation. Okay, and the English translation goes like this. I long have thought, my youthful friend, of something to have sent you, though it should serve no other end than just a kind memento. But how the subject theme may go, let time and chance determine. Perhaps it may turn out a song, perhaps turn out a sermon. And Burns goes on in that poem to give counsel and advice, to tell stories, to share wisdom, to encourage this young friend he's writing to. And that's what I want this podcast to be like. So in truth, I'm not going to do the preaching. We're going to let the poets and the poetry do the preaching. And what we're going to do is we're going to listen. We're going to receive the message. We're going to weigh the message. We're going to look at these poems and see if we can discover what they're trying to say. And then we're going to try to figure out if what they're trying to say is true. You see, we may not agree with everything that we listen to in a poem. We may not agree with everything that we listen to in a sermon either. But at the end of the day, what I want this podcast to do is to give us an opportunity to talk about and to discuss those things. And we may decide that, yes and amen. What that poem says is absolutely true and we just got to go with it. Or we may decide we need to ask more questions. I hope that this can be as much of a conversation as it is a sermon. So who knows what this podcast will eventually turn into, but the goal here is to try to find advice on ways to become better and more intentional people in how we live. I hope that we can be inspired inspired to reach for something that we may think to be beyond our grasp, or to imagine a vision of ourselves that we want to achieve. And maybe it'll even help us to see the world the way it really is, to see society as it really is, to see ourselves as we really are. And it'll help us to find the truth and the beauty within our own selves and our own lives. Because poetry has a lot to say and a lot to teach us about how we look at things. But poetry also has the power to move and shake the world. You see, words have power. If nothing else, these words should help us become deeper. They should expand our capacity to examine beauty and truth, and they should help us grow in our ability to reflect upon the words that we hear. And maybe, just maybe, poetry will help us create the world again, help us recreate ourselves. Like a sermon, poetry can shape our vision, how we see ourselves and the world around us. And like a good sermon, poetry can help us to become the people we deeply desire to be. Thank you for listening to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to having you back for more. If you like what you heard, please be sure to leave us a review and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for more content, you can find us on Apple, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, basically anywhere you find podcasts. If you want to join our community or just want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Preaching Poetry.